Hello everybody, welcome back to Marcelian Online, and let me tell you that the Melee meta is over. Long live the rise of Ranged and Mythic Plus. After the multiple weeks of testing Season 2 PTR, we have concluded aptly that it sucks to be a melee, and it seems a lot of people tend to agree. But are we all correct, and is it time to reroll from melee to ranged? I never like it when people tell me what to play because streamer X said this and the numbers in this YouTuber's video indicate that. Fuck that. I'ma play whatever I want. But, and this is a big but, I cannot lie, there is such a thing as a melee meta and ranged meta, and Season 1 definitely had a melee favored meta over anything else. Just to clarify, when I say melee meta, it does not mean that ranged DPS is fucking dead, okay? It just means that the top teams will likely have a melee-centric composition, and in general, melee DPS will find it easier to play Mythic Plus, either to just clear dungeons or simply get invited into groups. Also, let me make this abundantly clear for anyone deciding to main a spec or not invite a spec because of this video or any meta video. Warning, you will not like what I'm about to say. If you are a casual Mythic raider that gets half the bosses killed or less, if you do plus 12 keys or lower for portals and a bit more crests, what you play does not matter. You are not good enough to properly execute a meta spec and put to good use what that meta spec does best at 100%. So you might as well just play what you are best at or enjoy the most. That can still be a meta spec, by the way, but that doesn't mean that you maining an enhanced shaman will be a better player than a one-trick feral main. A one-trick feral main will absolutely smoke your ass if you always swap specs to the next flavor of the month. Yes, there, I said it, and just before you start bashing us in the comments, I am also like you. I swap mains every patch, so I will never be as good as someone maining the same off-meta spec for years, and it's fine. If anything, I usually tend to go the other way. I was a Fire Mage main in Season 1, maining a Ranged DPS spec in a melee meta comp, and the worst Mage spec on top of it. And I did 11s and 12s, and I also abso-fucking-lutely smoked the Enhanced Shaman in my group. And by the way, this is Fire Mage, and this is Enhance. I don't wanna hear it. Invite your ferals, your devastations, and play the goddamn game, bro. It's fine. You are not an MDI hero. You are not a world first player. Stop being so cringe and play with people that at least have cleared keys as high as you have. There, rant over. But on our streams, it's never over. It's never over. Twitch.tv/MarcelianOnline is where we conduct such business of being a rebel, an anarchist when it comes to pushing high-end PvE content, sometimes with you, the viewer. Check us out, the link is down below. To understand the Season 2 meta, let me tell you really quick why Season 1 has been a melee meta. It's not that complicated really, and it could have layers to it, but I will focus on one simple fact. Mechanics. Tuning and balance is also a thing. Specific spec damage profiles also influence it, but, and I said this almost a year ago in the War Within beta, when we were testing it, the changes to mob casts will push melee meta because you just need so many interrupts for the casters. Melees have faster interrupts by far than ranged and are usually way more competent at using crowd control, considering a ranged player, like my mage for instance, would have to blink into melee to use Dragon's Roar or Frost Nova. Not impossible, but way less reliable. You would want an enhanced shaman to knock mobs up rather than an elemental. As another example, at the beginning of Season 1, Resto Shaman was the shit, mostly because of the curse dispels and the poison cleansing totem, I would imagine, but I bet your bottom the wind shear interrupt, aka fastest kick in the game, also contributed a lot to why it was so good. It's no coincidence that once Prot Paladin, a tank with an insane amount of interrupts took up the mantle, people felt okay playing Discipline Priest, the only class in the game with no interrupts. It all revolved around the changes the devs did to Mythic Plus mobs to have their casts be more important and more numerous. And this matters because we now go into Season 2 where things change. Probably the biggest change we have is the drastic reduction in spellcasts that dungeon mobs have, which, thank God it happened. Although all dungeons have been affected by it, the best example for it is the new dungeon Operation Floodgate. The reason this is the best one to analyze is because it's the newest one they created, meaning the closest one to their current dungeon design philosophy, since the old ones are mostly said and done. I could probably count on one hand the actually important casts that need to be interrupted in this dungeon. There is the Serving Beam from the Venture Coast Surveyors that is locked onto the player, chasing them around with a fire beam that leaves fire puddles on the floor as it does so. You could also include the Bloodthirsty Cackle from the Hyena that buffs its allies, although it never proved to be deadly, just hard to deal with. Then you would have the Maximum Distortion cast from the Big Mama ads, where you get constant waves of pulsing damage while also being pushed back slightly. The players, that is. And I think that's it. There are a few filler casts like Lightning Bolts that are just that, fillers, and it's usually one of 3 packs that has at most 2 mobs that do this. This change is so drastic that I couldn't believe it. There might be an actual world where when doing this dungeon you can actually argue with your team whether or not to talent into an interrupt. It's still good to kick everything you can, of course, but not crucial anymore. The obvious conclusion of this is that you don't need fast interrupts, you don't need a prot paladin for interrupts, and you can use classes like priests, warlocks, and balance druids way more than in the past. This isn't enough to push meta to ranged, but it's enough to take away a big reason as to why playing melee is so important in Season 2, as opposed to Season 1. The next thing is the amount of AoE mechanics that force melee players to move away from the targets. Obviously, ranged also moves on occasion, but there is a difference here. You can have, for instance, the last pool in Floodgate where the guards do the AoE puddles that forces everyone to move. That is punishing to literally only ranged players, because melee players can just rotate around the target and keep DPSing. You also have the consecration style mechanics in Priory that ranged don't really get affected almost at all by, while melees can almost not do any damage at all. The difference between these two is that there are vastly more of the latter than the former, but also a fundamental difference between the downsides to each role. While me as a caster moving away from the swirly suck, I can still fire an instant spell, reapply a dot, refresh a buff, which are way more valuable than a weapon throw from a warrior, a flame shock from an enhanced shaman, or howling blast from a frost decay. There are of course outliers like Ret that has range on its abilities, Survival that can throw bombs, but I would argue neither of these would like to just fire their shit willy-nilly and waste buffs, waste procs and so on. Maybe it's biased, but I have found it way easier to play Affliction Warlock and Rookery than Enhancement Shaman in the same dungeon. And Rookery is a good example here because it had the most egregious zone denying mechanics that were also nerfed for their ridiculous punishing effect and still are incredibly tedious to deal with as a melee. Priory also has its own demons. The first part of the dungeon has a lot of packs that drop super deadly traps on the ground that not only root you but also apply a nasty bleed that needs a lot of healing. Ranged can do little side steps to avoid this, but melees have to constantly dodge the pack in keeping up with the movement of the tank. While the second part of Priory is even more outrageous. Dude, so many consecrated ground effects. It will either turn the meta into ranged or just have every party 1-3 red paladins that just don't give a fuck. And speaking of roots, we go back to our beloved Floodgate where we have these wonderful Venture Co architects that actually spam casts Nail Gun which roots targets. Often it happens that even if you break your root, you get another immediately after. For ranged DPS it doesn't matter that much since you can still hit your target, but for melee, if the pack is being moved, which it likely will, you end up with a fat lip waiting for a root dispel to happen. Dark Flame Cleft has its fair share of "oh my god, can I just DPS the thing" type mechanics, whether it's the big kobolds pushing melees away, or the big candles doing the same thing, or even the candle boss giving people the fire mechanic that needs to be dropped at the edge of the room away from the boss. Although it sucks for everyone, it extra sucks for melee. These style of mechanics on their own are not a big deal, but they stack up eventually where you will hate your life to have a tank, 2 to 3 melee DPS, and half the healers that also want to either be in melee or super close to the pack so they can AoE heal properly. This last point is very important since it has been a generic issue for a lot of WoW's PvE endgame content over the years, where ranged has been universally preferred over melees as a default. So it never takes a lot to tip the scales from melee to ranged, while the other way around kind of requires a little bit more effort. Spec and class balance also play a factor here, but this is still a wild card at the moment. You never know when the devs come out with a patch note that bonk every ranged DPS on the head, shifting everyone's expectations back to melee. This is unlikely, but not unheard of. It also applies to dungeon mechanics. The devs are actually on a warpath against dungeons being difficult and nerfing them left and right. This warpath is more like a thin little forest trail that you have to squint your eyes to see, but still leaning more towards nerfing mechanics than buffing them. This could change, but right now some of the best performing specs in the game start with Enhanced Shaman and follows it up with stuff like Fire Mage, Frost Mage, Destro Warlock, Beast Mastery Hunter, Augmentation Evoker, and Balance Druid before we even get to a potential second really well-tuned melee DPS spec. This is a side note since I haven't personally raid tested, but people have been saying the same thing about the raid mechanics favoring ranged over melee, which, to be fair, would be just like every other raid where everyone just wants more ranged all the time. Of course, you can still play melee. I will likely main a melee DPS anyway, but we are making this video first to point out that the season has the potential to be extra sucky for melee, but ideally to also not get people to fall into the meta trap where if you are not only not playing the right spec but also not the right kind of DPS, you cannot get into groups. The egregious mechanics are being addressed every week, and it seems like we could be moving towards a world where melee and ranged unfriendly mechanics are more or less even. We are not there yet, but could be there soon. And despite all of this, Marcelian and I are still looking at mainly melee DPS mains for the next season. We made a tier list ranking the potential main and all choices for season 2, which you can check right here, because we want to be paragons for the unheard voices of the community. You'll likely also not see hotter takes in terms of specs to main than in this video.